is Roger Green, host of the Surfing the NASH Tsunami podcast. This weekend, we are offering 6 conversations from Season 3, Episodes 28 and 29, our preview episode and wrap-up panel from the 5th International NASH Day. This conversation consists mostly of reactions from Jörn Schattenberg, Louise, Campbell, and me to Stephen Harrison's initial statement, followed by other thoughts from Stephen. The 3 of us are all impressed by the trial design. I observed that many of our most popular episodes have included one small window into ways to improve the clinical trial process, and that almost all those concepts are covered in this new design. This leads Stephen to describe the unparalleled amount of collaboration between sponsors, academics, regulators, pretty much the entire range of stakeholders to resolve this issue. He goes on to identify other issues, for example, disease naming, where the community is showing unparalleled collaboration. And all of this, he says, is leading to a proliferation of new research so vast, so broad in scope, that no one can keep up with all of it, not even him. There are 3 more points in this conversation. Jörn raises Quentin Anstee's comments from episode 26 that we need to develop a standard set of NITs to use in the evaluation as another area where collaboration will be key. Stephen points out that we may see our first drug approval in 2023, which will add new levels of energy and resourcing to the development and education processes in NASH and NAFLD. Jörn begins to discuss his issue, which is the convergence between conferences to cover a range of issues that look past simple drug development to improve and address all the key questions from drug evaluation to clinical care pathways and interspecialty collaboration to treat patients. All the things we will need eventually to address the NASH pandemic. It was an honor and privilege for Surfing NASH to be part of the biggest day on the Fatty Liver calendar. Both among ourselves and working with Jeff McIntyre, we got to explore a range of big issues. Yes, with a capital B for big and I for issues we don't always talk about on this podcast. We all had a great time doing it, and we hope you will have a great time listening to it. So sit back, listen, enjoy, learn, and when you're done, join the dialogue on our LinkedIn discussion group.
Jörn Schattenberg.
By introducing the second study, you kind of leap jump 3 or 5 years in that natural history of the patient group and just enroll patients that have already gone there. You know, it's not a different patient group. It's the same patients. They've progressed down the line. It's not a linear progression, we know, if you talk about the fibrosis burden. So time course can be variable. I fully agree that this is a very smart way to look at the patients down the road and dissect this or disconnect these difficulties we had from, a slowly progressive disease to the endpoints we want to study. So I think for that, these companies that are going this way are really helping us on the way forward.
Louise Campbell.
Jörn's right. It's not linear. We want to know where we're going with patients. We want to know how we can assess them. We are moving to a time when we're going to have to use in the real world, when these medications come up, doing trials in those formats ticks most of those boxes, which is really quite nice because we're going to be able to implement that trial program into real world. And I think that's the strength of what you're describing there from my perspective.
Stephen, I was thinking of another great Mississippian, William Faulkner, as I was listening to you. And Faulkner's novels had all these different threads in the beginning, and in the end, they all came together. I've been thinking about the best episodes on this podcast, the ones that get the most listen and the most response, either tend to be conferences or other news events, FDA meetings or something, or they tend to be papers that galvanize interest. And an extraordinary number of those are all in the story, are all in this statement you just made, right? The complex hepatocyte episode did really well. When Alina Allen comes on and talks about MRE, it does really well. The episode you did with, I think, Arun last year about is Sanyal, about is cirrhosis the way to do drug development, did really well. And what's so exceptional is that each of those things was a piece, and through the work that you're talking about, they all blend together, and it winds up coming out as a tapestry, which is, I've never thought of clinical trials as a work of art, but that's frighteningly close to what I think I'm hearing. Certainly a work of craft. I was just amazed.
Stephen Harrison.
Well, I think there's so many major contributors to that tapestry, or another way to say it is mosaic. It's just amazing how we are really beginning to come together and work alongside each other to address these questions. I think we're breaking down stovepipes, we're breaking down barriers, we're aligning. You take the NAFLD-MAFLD discussion as something that is a good analogy. We are in the middle of a Delphi process to address the right name for this. Should we change the name? If so, what should it be? And there will be unprecedented international dialogue in July where we go through the Delphi process, we unpack it, we have a discussion about it, and we move forward on a unified front. At least that's my hope. And I think we're seeing that in the drug development space. Quentin was on with us, 2 weeks ago, I guess, talking about monitoring therapeutic effect of drug using NITs and really beginning to tease apart novel ways to look at that using, how long has that NIT been down versus relative to the length of time they were on treatment, and looking at stacked NITs, combining things like drop in ALT with drop in PDFF, change in FIB4, change in FibroScan. Is one NIT change just as good as 2 concurrent change, or 3? Is that better than 2, which is better than 1? If you drop ALT by 17 units in the first 4 weeks, is that better than waiting until week 36 to drop ALT by 17 units? Or does it not really matter? I think in a lot of ways, 2-3 years ago, we wouldn't be having these brainstorm discussions and looking at how we can combine data and work in a unified fashion to address these, find new questions, address those, and advance the field. This is where we're seeing linear growth, Jörn. We're seeing just year after year, the number of publications in NASH that are coming out. It's unfathomable how we've just really focused on this area, and the data that's coming out, it's hard to keep up with. I mean, Jörn, this is all I do for a living is fatty liver disease, and I can't keep up with it.
There you go. I think one important thing, Stephen, is that I'm reminded by the episode we had with Quentin, is that we need to define the minimum required set of NITs. If you run an HCV trial, nobody would not think about doing HCV RNA. But if you run a NASH trial, people start using different markers and technology. So I think I don't see that clearly yet. And you mentioned that the optimal endpoint, or maybe there's still ongoing debate on what we're going to read out if we leave certain readouts behind. So I think that's the most critical next step to actually agree as a field. And the way the international consortia, but also, for example, NAIL and NIT are looking at this is really, we're going to get this done very soon and define that set of minimal required NITs.
Yeah, that's another great example of where finally, 2022, we have become like-minded in the sense that we want to share data. We want to mine it for what we can get out of it. And Jörn, you and I have discussed this for the past 5, if not 10 years. How come we can't pool data together and use the power of data to drive the field forward? Everybody's been stovepiped. You can't look at my data. We're not going to combine it with this data. Now we begin to see that that's happening. So whether it's NAIL NIT, it's Litmus, it's Nimble, it's all of it, I think is huge. And then you throw in International NASH Day and where that was when was it started? 4 years ago? 5 years ago? I can't even remember. And advance it to where we are today. It's almost like, to use the surfing the NASH tsunami, it's almost a tsunami of information that's being provided to patients. And you see huge inroads made by GLI and the Fatty Liver Foundation and others, where patient awareness is beginning to grow. And I think it's all going to culminate. We have 2 potential drugs that are in play for potential FDA approval in 2023. One is a beta-cholic acid, still trying to get across the finish line, and then resmetirom, a thyroid hormone receptor beta drug. So if we could get to 2023 and have 1 or 2 of those drugs approved, the groundswell of education that's happening, the knowledge that's growing amongst our constituents in the field, the providers, and then also on Capitol Hill and those that help us there and around the world. I think there's so much that's happened in the past year, but from my foxhole, the changes we've seen in drug development are going to be pivotal in helping us with future drug development.
Okay, so Jörn, why don't we go to you?
Following up with what Stephen says, I think the most impressive moments or aspects that happened from my perspective in this year kind of follow up the same line. There have been great conferences and meetings where people got together to discuss how is the field evolving. It started out with NASH-TAG, where the regulators actually came to sit down, that fireside chat with clinical researchers to start thinking about the redefinition of those endpoints. And the other meeting we just had recently in Barcelona to pull together all these stakeholders others, including nurses, primary care, and endocrinologists, to say, what are we going to need to identify these patients, and what are we going to do once we have a drug? How are we going to treat or follow them up? And I think this discussion, that wouldn't have been thought of 2 or 3 years ago. We're really advancing to the point where we're ready fit for clinical practice, and we got to think about how to implement these changes in everyday life. It's something, if you sit in a specialty clinic, Stephen says he's doing this for his living. I have a little bit more diversity in my clinical duties, but there is a lot of patients still, the only I can offer them is enrolling them into clinical trials or, helping them to the next treadmill or nutritionist. And I think this is going to change very soon, and I feel a lot of momentum in the field on that level.
So the idea of momentum in the field is interesting, right? I mean, momentum among the people in the NASH meeting is one thing, but then getting some excitement out into the broader community is I think, huge. I also think when you talk about that, I also think of things like the ACE guidelines, the idea being that other societies have started to put more messaging out there, the American Heart Association paper, AGA, that more societies have started to put more out there about why this matters. So Jeff Lazarus, the first time he came on, said hepatology can't do this alone. But now I'm not sure hepatology has to do it alone entirely. And I think that reflects energy back on hepatology from the other sources as well. It's an interesting dynamic, I think.
Yeah, it's not physicians that have to do it themselves. And one thing I wrapped my head around was the NASH nurse we're talking about. And, something that Louise can maybe follow up on, of course. But we need assistant or supportive disciplines here to really help us tackle this.
And now, back to Roger.
We hope you've enjoyed this recording. If you have any questions or comments about the content of this conversation or the entire episode, please send an email to questions@surfingnash.com. We will be back next week to preview the 2022 International Liver Congress from EASL. Until then, stay safe and surf on. We'll see you on the podcast. Bye-bye now.